Welcome back. Hey, my dear friends. Close your eyes. Somewhere in what we now call Europe just before dawn, a person is standing at the edge of an oak grove. Not a warrior, not a king, someone who has spent 20 years learning things that were never written down, because the people who taught them believed knowledge changed when it was trapped on a page. They are not performing a ritual. They are waiting for the light to change, thinking about a question their community could not answer on its own. In a few moments, they will walk back and speak, and what they say will carry the weight of law, memory, healing, and whatever human beings mean when they reach for the word sacred. We do not know their name. What we know is this. For centuries, people like this existed across the Celtic world, and Rome, the most powerful empire the Western world had yet produced, treated them as something more politically dangerous than ordinary enemies. Why would an empire that conquered kingdoms, absorbed nations, and governed millions concern itself with people who had no cities, no armies, and no written books? That is where this story begins. Not with a battle, not with a ruin, but with a form of knowledge that lived entirely inside human beings. Settle in. Let the room go quiet. The light is just beginning to change. Chapter 1. Before the name. Picture a young person, leaving their family, not for war, not for trade, for something that has no clean modern equivalent. A kind of learning so long and so total that by time it was finished, the world the young person had left would have changed, and they would have changed more. Children who had been born when they left would be adults. Parents who had been strong might be gone. The training, according to the sources we have, took as long as 20 years. 20 years of memorizing enormous quantities of verse, of learning the structure of the law, of absorbing the accumulated decisions of generations of people who had thought carefully about how the world worked and what the community owed to it. No writing, new texts to consult. Everything held in the mind, reproduced through the mind, tested against the minds of teachers who had done the same thing for 20 years before you. When that young person came back, they would be one of the most important people in their world, not the most powerful, in the sense of commanding armies or owning land. Something different. The person whose judgment settled disputes that could not be settled by force. The person who knew what the signs in the natural world meant and what they required. The person who held the community's memory across generations and could tell you what had been decided before and why, and what it meant for the question in front of you now. The question underneath all of this is the one this chapter is really about. Why did a society produce them at all? Every human group that has ever existed has developed ways of managing the things that matter most and cannot be handled by physical force alone. The timing of planting and harvest, the resolution of disputes between people who have to keep living near each other after the dispute is settled, the rituals that mark the moments when a life changes, the preservation of everything the group knows and needs to keep knowing. In some societies, these functions get divided among different kinds of specialists. Priests handle the sacred, judges handle the legal, healers handle the medical, teachers handle the transmission of knowledge to the next generation. In Celtic society, across a wide range of times and places, all of these functions appear to have converged in a single class of people. That convergence is not an accident. It is a product of a specific kind of world, and to understand it, you have to go back further than the Druids themselves. The Celts are not a race. This is worth saying clearly, because the word has been misused enough times over the past 2 centuries that it carries baggage it was never meant to carry. Modern scholarship understands the Celts primarily as a cultural and linguistic grouping, people who spoke related languages belonging to the Celtic branch of the Indo-European family, and who shared enough artistic, religious, and social practices that we can recognize a kind of family resemblance across a very wide geography. The Celtic languages as a distinct group appear to have begun emerging sometime in the late 2nd millennium B.C., in a region centered on what is now Central Europe, the area around the Alps and the Upper Danube, by around 800 B.C., the date where our story officially begins. The archaeological record shows us what historians call the Holat culture, named after a site in what is now Austria, where a remarkable collection of graves and artifacts was discovered in the 19th century. The Hallstatt culture overlaps significantly with the world in which early Celtic-speaking societies were developing, and it gives us one of our clearest early windows into the material world those societies inhabited. What does that world look like? It is not a world of cities. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the environment that produced the Druids. The Celtic-speaking peoples of this period did not build urban centers on the scale of the Mediterranean world. They lived in a landscape of scattered settlements, farmsteads, small villages, hill forts that served as centers of local power and refuge in times of conflict. The organizational logic of Celtic society was fundamentally different from the city-state model developing simultaneously around the Mediterranean. In a world without cities, certain things that cities make easy become very difficult. A city concentrates population, which makes it possible to support full-time specialists, people whose entire labor is devoted to a single function because enough other people are producing enough surplus to feed them. A city also creates physical infrastructure for storing and transmitting information, archives, libraries, schools, the whole apparatus that literate urban civilization uses to carry knowledge from one generation to the next. Celtic society in this period had neither of these things in the same way. What it had instead was something older and in some ways more demanding. It had memory, the transmission of everything that mattered, law and genealogy and cosmology, and medical knowledge, and the history of the community, and the protocols for every important ritual happened through human beings, not through texts, not through institutions with physical addresses, through people who had spent years doing almost nothing except learning to hold all of that inside their minds and reproduce it accurately. The Greek writer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, describes the Druids as one of 3 tenored classes among the Gauls. He describes them as the most just of men, entrusted with both divine and human matters. Julius Caesar, in his account of the GIC Wars, written around the same period, says the Druids are concerned with divine worship, the due performance of sacrifices, and the interpretation of ritual questions. He also says something that has struck every reader who has encountered it. He says they are exempt from military service and from all taxation. Think about what that means in a society organized around survival, defense, and agricultural production. To be exempt from both fighting and from the obligation to contribute economically means that the community has collectively decided that what you do is more valuable than either of those things. It means the society has looked at what you carry and concluded that losing it would be worse than losing a fighter or a farmer. Caesar also tells us that candidates for the Druidic class sometimes train for as long as 22 years, memorizing enormous quantities of verse, because, as he puts it, they do not think it proper to commit their doctrines to writing. He notes they use the Greek alphabet for most other purposes. So the choice not to write down sacred knowledge is not a matter of not knowing how, it is a deliberate decision. Scholars have interpreted this in several ways, and it is worth being honest that we cannot know with certainty which interpretation is correct. Some have argued that oral transmission was considered more secure, harder to steal or misuse by someone who had not earned the knowledge through years of study. Some have suggested that the act of memorization itself transformed the student, that you became different by carrying the knowledge in your body, rather than being able to look it up. Some have proposed more practical reasons, that a text can be captured and read by an enemy, while knowledge stored in a living person disappears with them rather than being surrendered. What all of these interpretations share is the recognition that this was a choice. A society that knew about writing chose not to use it for its most important knowledge, and that choice shaped everything about what the Druids were and how they operated. The world that produced them was a world where the most powerful thing a person could be was not a warrior and not a king. It was someone who knew more than anyone else and could not be replaced by a document. Now think about what happens when that world comes into contact with a civilization that believes the opposite. A civilization that writes everything down, that has archives and laws carved in stone and administrative records going back centuries. A civilization that believes knowledge is something you store outside the human body, in a place where it can survive the death of any individual person. That collision is coming. But before we get there, we need to understand what the Druids actually were inside the society that made them. Caesar makes an observation that is easy to read past, but becomes more interesting the longer you stay with it. He notes that the Druidic institution is thought to have originated in Britain and to have been carried from there to Gaul, and that those who want to study it most thoroughly still travel to Britain for that purpose. He is describing something that has a center of gravity, a place that other practitioners recognize as authoritative, an institution made entirely of people. No building, no charter, no permanent address. A network connected by shared training and shared knowledge and mutual recognition, spread across a geography larger than most ancient empires, sustained entirely by the willingness of each generation to spend 20 years learning what the previous generation knew. The question of what they believed, what their cosmology looked like, what the rituals meant, is one we will get to. But before we can understand what they believed, we need to understand what function they served. In a world without cities, without writing, without centralized political authority, the Druids were the answer to a question every human society eventually has to answer. How do we keep being us? How do we make sure that what we know survives the death of the people who know it? How do we make sure that the dispute resolved 10 years ago establishes a precedent for the dispute happening today? How do we make sure that the stars our grandparents watched still have the same names and the same meanings when our grandchildren look up at them? The answer the Celtic world arrived at was a class of human beings who devoted their lives to becoming that answer. Whether it was wise or fragile or both is something this story will have to reckon with, but it held for many centuries across an enormous stretch of the ancient world. It held. Chapter 2. What the word actually means. Imagine a student on their first day of that 20-year training. They are standing somewhere they have never stood before, in a place that feels both ordinary and entirely different from the world they grew up in. The trees around them are the same trees. The light is the same light, but the people here have spent decades learning to see both of those things differently, and the student does not yet know what they do not know. At some point in those early years, someone will explain to them what they are called, what the word means, why it was chosen, and that explanation, whatever form it took in the ancient world, is the thing we no longer have. What we have instead is the word itself, and what can be reconstructed from it. The scholarly consensus, which has held up reasonably well across more than a century of linguistic research, is that the word derives from two roots in the ancient Celtic languages. The first element is most likely related to the Proto-Celtic word connected to oak, appearing in various forms across the Celtic language family, and linking to a wider Indo-European root that also shows up in the Greek word for tree and the Latin word for hardwood. The second element is more straightforward. It connects to a root meaning knowledge, to see, to know, the same root that appears in the Sanskrit word for wisdom. Put them together, and you get something like deep knowledge, or knowledge of the oak, or the one who knows very deeply, depending on how you read the first element. Now here is where the honest version of this story parts ways with most popular accounts. Some scholars have questioned the oak interpretation of the first element. A small number have proposed alternative etymologies. The debate is not settled with the kind of absolute finality that gets printed in general audience books as established fact. What can be said with confidence is that the second element, the knowledge root, appears secure. Whatever else the word means, it almost certainly contains the idea of knowing or seeing in a deep or special sense. But here is what matters more than the etymology. When you start looking for the word Druid in the actual ancient sources, something immediately becomes clear that most popular treatments never quite say directly. Almost everything we know about the Druids was written by people who were not Druids. This is not a minor footnote. It is the central fact that shapes every other fact in this entire story. The Druids themselves, by deliberate choice, did not write down their knowledge or their history or their theology. The result is that the written record comes almost entirely from outside observers, and those observers fall into three broad categories, each with its own limitations and its own motivations. The first category is the classical writers, Greeks and Romans who encountered the Celtic world and described it from a Mediterranean perspective. This group includes Julius Caesar, Strabo, Diodorus, Sigillus, Pomponius, Mela, Pliny the Elder, and Tacitus, among others. They were writing in Latin and Greek for Latin and Greek audiences. Most had limited direct contact with the Druids they described. Several had political reasons to describe the Celtic world in particular ways. The second category is the medieval Irish and Welsh texts, documents written down by Christian monks and scholars in Ireland and Wales, beginning roughly in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, preserving material from oral tradition that was far older than the manuscripts themselves. They were written centuries after the period we are studying by people with their own religious frameworks, and the process of transmission almost certainly changed things in ways we cannot fully trace. The third category is archaeology, the physical evidence left in the ground, graves and ritual, deposits, and the remains of structures and the objects that people made and used and discarded. Archaeology cannot tell us what people believed or what they said, but it can tell us what they did. Each category gives us something real. None gives us anything close to a complete picture. Take the classical sources first, because they are the most detailed and the most complicated. Julius Caesar's account in his record of the GIC Wars is the longest single ancient description of Druidic practice that survives. Caesar was in Gaul for nearly a decade as a military commander, and he had more direct exposure to Guish society than most Roman writers of his era. His account includes specifics that have the quality of genuine observation: the 20-year training period, the exemption from military service and taxation, the assembly of Druids from across Gaul in the territory of the Carnot tribe for an annual gathering, the use of the Greek alphabet for ordinary purposes alongside the refusal to commit sacred knowledge to writing. But Caesar is also a politician, writing for a political audience. His account is not a neutral document. It is a text designed to justify his military campaigns, to demonstrate the importance of what he was doing, and to present the Gauls as simultaneously impressive enough to make his conquest meaningful and sufficiently different from Roman civilization to make that conquest necessary. None of this means Caesar was lying. It means he was doing what every writer does, selecting what to include, framing it in ways that serve his purposes, describing things from within his own cultural assumptions. Picture Caesar himself for a moment, a man of extraordinary intelligence and ambition, sitting in a military camp somewhere in Gaul, writing dispatches that he knows will be read aloud in Rome. He has spent years watching Gaulish society from the outside. He has talked to people who know it from the inside. He is writing about something real. He is also writing about something that needs to serve a purpose. Both of those things are true at the same time. Learning to hold both of them is what makes it possible to use Caesar as a source without being misled by him. Strabo, writing slightly later than Caesar, describes the Druids as one of three honored groups in Guish society, alongside the Bards and the Vates. His Druids are specifically concerned with moral philosophy and are considered the most just of men, to the point where not only private disputes, but even public controversies are submitted to their judgment. This is a genuinely interesting portrait because it emphasizes something that tends to get lost in popular accounts. The Druids, as Strabo describes them, are fundamentally a legal and philosophical institution. Their authority rests not on military force or hereditary rank, but on a reputation for wisdom and justice that the society has collectively decided to invest in them. Diodorus Sigulus, a Greek historian writing in the 1st century BC, adds another layer. He describes 3 classes and emphasizes the role of the bards as praise poets, whose songs could stop a battle in progress, because warriors on both sides would pause to listen. He notes that the Druids are philosophers and theologians, and that the Gauls make no sacrifice without a Druid present. Pomponius Miller, a Roman geographer writing in the 1st century AD, gives us one of the most specific details in the entire classical record. He says the Druids teach many things to the nobles of Gaul in caves and remote forests, and that one of their key doctrines is that souls do not perish, but pass after death into other bodies. The soul doctrine Ma describes shows up in enough different classical sources that it has a reasonable claim to being a genuine element of Druidic teaching, at least in the regions those sources describe. Interestingly, it is also a doctrine associated with Pythagorean philosophy in the Greek world, and a number of ancient writers noted this parallel. Whether there was genuine historical contact between Pythagorean and Druidic thought, or whether the parallel reflects independent development, or whether the classical writers were simply mapping a familiar concept onto something they only partially understood, is a question that scholars continue to discuss without resolution. Get comfortable with that phrase. Scholars continue to discuss without resolution. It will come up again in this story more than once. Now turn to the medieval Irish and Welsh texts, because they give us something the classical sources almost entirely lack. The classical writers describe the Druids from the outside. The medieval Irish texts, whatever their limitations, preserve material that comes from within the Celtic tradition itself, even if that tradition had been transformed by centuries of change before anyone wrote it down. The great cycles of Irish mythology, written down beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries by monks who were preserving material that was clearly much older, contain figures who carry the characteristics associated with Druids in the classical sources, figures who read the sky and interpret natural signs, figures who serve as advisors to kings whose pronouncements carry legal force, figures who can lay binding obligations on others through formal declaration, who can curse or bless with words in ways that the narrative treats as genuinely effective rather than merely symbolic. These texts do not use the word Druid consistently. By the time they were written down, centuries of Christian influence had reshaped how Irish and Welsh societies describe their own past. But the functional role they describe, the class of people who carry the community's most important knowledge, and whose judgment settles disputes that cannot be settled by other means, is recognizably continuous with what Caesar and Strauss were describing from the outside. And then there is archaeology. Think for a moment about what it means to look for the physical traces of people who deliberately chose not to leave written records, who conducted their most important activities in natural settings that leave no permanent structures, who deposited their most sacred objects in water, where the current eventually carries them to places we have not yet found. The archaeological record gives us real evidence, ritual deposits in watery places, weapons and valuables, and sometimes human remains deposited in lakes and rivers and bogs across a wide swathe of northwestern Europe. Evidence of practices that were clearly significant and clearly widespread, but evidence that resists the kind of precise interpretation that written records allow. The physical traces are there. What they meant to the people who made them is something we can reason about carefully, but cannot know with certainty. The honest summary of where all of this leaves us is this. We have a genuine historical phenomenon, a class of people who occupied a specific and important role in their societies across a wide geography and a long time frame, whose training was rigorous and whose authority was real. We have descriptions of them from outside observers, who were sometimes hostile and always operating from their own frameworks. We have traces of them in later literary traditions that preserve something real, even as they transform it. We have physical evidence of the ritual world they inhabited, even when that evidence resists certain interpretation. What we do not have is anything from the Druids themselves. No text, no doctrine in their own words, no account of what it felt like to spend 20 years becoming the living library of your world. That absence is not a gap that better scholarship will eventually fill. It is a structural feature of the subject. The Druids chose not to write down what mattered most to them, and the result is that we see them only in reflection, in the distorted mirror of their observers, in the transformed echo of the tradition that outlasted them. The mirror is all we have. Learning to read it carefully, to see both what it shows and how it distorts, is the whole discipline of this subject. And it begins now. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Power. Somewhere in Gaul, roughly 2,000 years ago, a dispute has reached the point where ordinary resolution is no longer possible. Two communities, perhaps on either side of a boundary, that one of them says has always been in one place, and the other says has always been somewhere else. The specific content does not matter for our purposes. What matters is what happens next. The parties involved do not go to a court building, because there is no court building. They do not appeal to a king, because the kind of authority this dispute requires is different from the kind a king holds. What they do, according to the sources we have, is go to the Druids, and the Druids decide not with a weapon, not with a threat, with a judgment. And the judgment holds because everyone involved, the disputing parties and the watching community, has already agreed that this is how things work, that the judgment of these particular people carries a weight that cannot simply be refused without consequences far larger than the original dispute. Julius Caesar calls the ultimate sanction exclusion from the sacrifices. He says it is considered the greatest of punishments because it places the excluded person outside the community in the most fundamental sense possible. Not just cut off from social life, cut off from the ritual life that connects the community to the divine order of the world. Think about that for a moment. An institution with no army and no treasury, enforcing its decisions through the credible threat of meaning, of belonging, of being part of the world that matters. That is the thing we are trying to understand. But to understand it fully, we need to look more carefully at the structure, because the class of country, it had internal differentiation, something that looked, at least from the outside, like specialization within a shared identity. Strauss names three groups: bards, vates, and druids in the strict sense. Other classical writers use slightly different terms or different organizational schemes, and there is genuine scholarly debate about whether these distinctions reflect real, functional differences, regional variation, different historical periods, or simply different ways of describing the same thing from the outside. But Strauss's threefold distinction is detailed enough and consistent enough with other sources that it is worth taking seriously, not as a definitive organizational chart, but as a genuine attempt to describe something real. Start with the bards, because in some ways they are the most immediately recognizable. The bards were poets, but poet in this context means something that takes work to recover from its modern associations. In contemporary usage, poetry is primarily a literary form, words arranged with attention to sound and rhythm, appreciated for aesthetic qualities. The bard in Celtic society was something more and something different. The bard was a specialist in the power of speech, and in a world where the most important knowledge was stored in human memory and transmitted through human voices, the person who had mastered the techniques of memorable speech was not a decorative figure. They were infrastructure. The training of a bard, according to what can be reconstructed from later Irish sources that appear to preserve genuinely old traditions, involved memorizing enormous numbers of poems and stories. The forms were highly elaborate, built on complex patterns of sound and meter that made them extraordinarily difficult to misremember. Every departure from the correct form was an error that would be caught by others who knew the constry, material. This is not incidental. The elaborateness of the poetic forms was a technology for accurate transmission. If a poem has to fit a precise metrical and sound pattern, and if the people listening know that pattern as well as you do, then you cannot easily change the words without someone noticing. The form itself was a check on the accuracy of memory. The content preserved in these forms was not primarily what we would call entertainment, though it certainly included stories told for pleasure. It included genealogies, the lines of descent that established who had legitimate claim to land and title and authority. It included legal precedents, the records of decisions made in past disputes. It included what we might call history, the accounts of significant events that the community needed to remember, and it included praise and blame. Diodorus notes that the bards composed songs in honor of some men and in reproach of others, and that these songs carried genuine social weight. A poet's praise could establish a person's reputation across a wide geography. A poet's satire could damage it in ways that were considered genuinely harmful, not just embarrassing, but capable of causing real damage to a person's standing and livelihood. In a society without a centralized government, capable of enforcing law by force, the threat of permanent reputational damage was a meaningful tool of social control. The bards were, among other things, the people who wielded that tool. Now move to the vates, because they occupy an interesting position that is harder to describe in modern terms. Stryo describes them as seers and natural philosophers who perform sacrifices. Other sources add the element of divination, the practice of reading signs in the natural world to determine what the future holds or what the gods require. The vates appear to have been particularly concerned with the relationship between the human world and the natural world, with the signs written in the behavior of birds and animals, and the patterns of weather and the movements of stars. They were the people you consulted when you needed to know whether a particular day was auspicious for a particular action. There is a practical dimension to this that is easy to miss. A person who has spent years closely observing the natural world, who knows the normal patterns of animal behavior and weather and seasonal change intimately enough to recognize deviations from those patterns, has genuine expertise that can translate into useful knowledge. The ability to read approaching weather from animal behavior and cloud formations could save lives in an agricultural society dependent on the harvest. The boundary between what we would call superstition and what we would call practical knowledge was not drawn in the same place in the ancient world that it is drawn in ours. Treating the vates as simply primitive fortune tellers misses the genuine knowledge their practice was built around, even if the interpretive framework they used looks very different from what we would consider scientific today. And then there are the Druids, in the narrower sense, the group that gave their name to the whole class. If the bards were specialists in the power of speech, and the vates were specialists in the interpretation of natural signs, the Druids, in the strict sense, appear to have been something closer to what we might call theologians and jurists. They held the deepest knowledge of how the cosmos worked, and what the relationship between the human world and the divine world required, and from that knowledge flowed their authority in legal and political matters. Caesar's account emphasizes the legal function. He says the Druids are the judges in nearly all disputes, whether public or private, cases involving murder, inheritance disputes, boundary questions between communities. All of these are submitted to the Druids for judgment. This is a remarkable form of authority, and it is worth sitting with what makes it work. The Druids had no army. They did not enforce their judgments through physical coercion, in any direct sense. Their authority rested entirely on the belief of the community that their judgments were legitimate, that their knowledge of how the cosmos worked gave them access to a kind of justice that was deeper than what any individual or faction could achieve through force. In political terms, this is sometimes called legitimacy as opposed to power. Power is the capacity to compel people through force, or the credible threat of force. Legitimacy is the quality that makes people willing to accept decisions as binding without being compelled. The Druids were in this sense a legitimacy institution. They worked because everyone agreed they worked, and they had structured the conditions of their own authority carefully enough that agreement was very difficult to withdraw. The training system was part of this. 20 years is long enough that by the time someone completes it, they have invested so much of their life in the institution that they have every reason to maintain its authority. The institution reproduces its own legitimacy through the depth of the commitment it demands. The oral transmission was part of this too. Knowledge that exists only in the minds of a specific trained class is knowledge that the class controls completely. There is no text that an outsider can read and use to challenge the official interpretation. The knowledge belongs to the people who hold it in their memory, and only they can say what it contains. This could be read as a form of monopoly, a way of protecting the institution's power by making its knowledge inaccessible to outsiders. It could also be read as a genuine expression of a philosophy that believed living knowledge transmitted through relationship and developed through years of practice, was different in kind from written knowledge, not just a different medium for the same thing, a fundamentally different kind of understanding. Both of these readings are probably partly true. Institutions rarely have single pure motives. The Druidic system served the interests of those inside it, and it also reflected genuine beliefs about what knowledge was. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Now step back and look at what the whole structure implies. A society that invested in bards had decided that the accurate preservation and performance of its most important knowledge was worth supporting a class of specialists to do. A society that invested in vates had decided that the interpretation of natural signs was a skill specialized enough to require dedicated practitioners. A society that invested in Druids, in the strict sense, had decided that questions of cosmic order and legal judgment were too important to be left to whoever happened to have political power at the moment. Each of these investments reflects a set of values, a willingness to exempt certain people from ordinary economic and military obligations, because what they do is more important, a recognition that the community has needs that cannot be met by force or by farming. The Druidic solution was not the only way human societies have answered these questions. The literate urban civilizations of the Mediterranean solved them differently through writing and archives and professional specialized institutions. But the Druidic solution worked. It held a politically fragmented world together through shared knowledge rather than through shared government. It managed the relationship between the human world and the sacred through specialists who had devoted their lives to understanding that relationship. It preserved the accumulated wisdom of many generations in the minds of the people who needed it most. And it did all of this without a single building, a single document, or a single soldier. Somewhere tonight, someone is trying to solve the same problems these people solved with entirely different tools in an entirely different world. They have not yet found a solution that works as well or lasts as long. Chapter 4. The Oak and the Unseen. Stand in a forest of oak trees in late October, not a walk through a park. A real forest old enough that the canopy closes overhead and the light comes through in pieces, gold and faint, moving when the wind moves. The oaks at this time of year are halfway between summer and winter, the leaves still on the branches but beginning to turn brown and orange at the edges, the green draining out of them slowly, the way color drains out of everything in that season. Now look up in the high branches of one of the older trees. Something is growing that does not belong there. A cluster of green, impossibly green for October, round and dense against the dying leaves around it. Mistletoe, growing from the bark of the oak itself, drawing its life from the tree, staying green while everything around it prepares to go dormant. For the people who watch this forest, with the attention that comes from a lifetime of careful observation, that cluster of green in the high branches of an oak in late October was not an ordinary thing. It was a sign. Of what exactly, we cannot say with certainty, because the people who could have told us chose not to write it down, but that it was significant, that it marked this particular tree as different from the others around it, is something that appears clearly enough in the sources we have to take seriously. This is where this chapter begins, not with doctrine or theology, but with a person looking up at a tree and seeing something that requires explanation. Because here is the problem that sits at the center of this entire chapter, and the honest thing to do is name it before going any further. We do not have a Druidic text, not a single one. No cosmological treatise written by a Druid explaining how they understood the universe. No ritual manual describing what the ceremonies meant. No theological document laying out the relationship between the human world and the divine world as the Druids themselves conceived it. What we have is a collection of fragments, descriptions from outsiders who interpreted Druidic practice through their own frameworks. Later Irish and Welsh texts that preserve echoes of pre-Christian Celtic belief, but were transformed by centuries of transmission and the Christian context in which they were. Finally written down, archaeological evidence that shows us what people did in ritual contexts without telling us what they thought it meant. From these fragments, scholars have attempted to reconstruct something of the Druidic worldview. Some of what they have found is well supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. Some of it is more speculative. A responsible account has to be clear about which is which, even when the more speculative parts are also the more interesting parts. With that said, let us look at what the evidence actually suggests. Begin with the doctrine that appears most consistently across the ancient sources. Consistency across independent sources is the closest thing we have to a reliable signal in this kind of historical work. Multiple classical writers, including Pomponius Mela, Diodorus Culus, and Caesar himself, describe the Druids as teaching that the soul does not perish at death, but passes into another body. The phrasing varies across the accounts. Some describe transmigration from one human body to another. Some describe a more complex picture involving the soul's journey through different forms of existence. But the core idea that death is not an ending, but a transition, appears consistently enough across enough independent sources that most scholars treat it as a genuine element of Druidic and teaching, at least as practiced in the regions those sources describe. Caesar makes an observation about this doctrine worth reading carefully. He says the Druids consider this teaching the principal incentive to valor, since it removes the fear of death. He is explaining it in military terms as a practical tool for producing brave fighters, which is exactly the kind of explanation a Roman general would find most legible. But the teaching itself, if it was genuinely held, implies something much larger than a recruiting tool. A belief that the soul continues after death and returns in new form is not just a comforting idea about what happens to individuals. It is a statement about the structure of time and the nature of existence. It implies that the individual life is one chapter in a much longer story. It implies that the cosmos is organized in a fundamentally cyclical way, rather than a linear one. That cyclical orientation appears to run through what we can reconstruct of the Druidic worldview in multiple ways. The Celtic calendar is one of the clearest pieces of evidence we have for this orientation. The Irish textual tradition describes 4 major seasonal festivals, marking the transitions between the seasons. The festival known as Sin falling at the end of October and the beginning of November marked the transition into the dark half of the year. Imbolc, in February, was associated with the first signs of spring. Beltane, in May, marked the beginning of summer. Lughnasadh, in August, was connected to the harvest. A bronze tablet discovered in France in 1897, known as the Colgi calendar, and dated to around the 1st or 2nd century AD, provides additional physical evidence for the sophisticated structure of the Celtic year, showing a system built around a careful balancing of lunar and solar cycles. Though the specific festival names and their details come primarily from the Irish textual tradition, rather than from the calendar itself. Together, these sources suggest a year organized around cycles rather than around progress, toward a fixed endpoint. A world in which the return of darkness is not a defeat, but a necessary part of the pattern. Hold that idea. It will matter later. Now come back to the oak tree and the person looking up at the mistletoe in the high branches. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, gives us one of the most specific accounts we have of a Druidic ritual. He describes a ceremony in which the Druids climb an oak tree to cut mistletoe growing on it, catching it in a white cloth so it does not touch the ground, then conducting a sacrifice. Pliny explicitly connects the Druids' name to the word for oak, and says they hold nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and the tree on which it grows. Pliny was not present at this ceremony. He is working from earlier sources. Historians treat the specific details with appropriate caution, but the association of the oak with Druidic practice appears in enough different contexts that some version of it is almost certainly real. Why the oak specifically? Several answers have been proposed, and they are not mutually exclusive. To say oak is among the longest-lived trees native to the Celtic world, with lifespans that can exceed several hundred years. In a culture built around the importance of memory and the transmission of knowledge across generations, a tree that outlives human generations by many multiples would naturally carry a different kind of significance. The oak also has a distinctive relationship with lightning, being struck more frequently than most other tree species in European forests, a fact that ancient observers would have noticed, and that would have given it an obvious connection to celestial fire. Mistletoe grows on oak trees relatively rarely, which would have given its appearance on a particular oak a quality of the remarkable, and it stays green through the winter when the oak itself has lost its leaves, connecting it to exactly the themes of continuity through the dark season that appear throughout the evidence for Celtic religious thought. The green cluster in the bare branches of a winter oak is a small miracle if you are paying attention, and these were people who paid attention. Now move to the cosmological structure, the question of how the Druids understood the organization of the universe. Here we are working with material that requires more caution because it depends heavily on the tombed, later Irish and Welsh texts, which were written down long after the period we are studying, and in a context thoroughly shaped by Christian thought. The picture that emerges from those texts, with appropriate caution about how much transformation the material has undergone, suggests a world organized in layers, a realm above, associated with celestial beings, and with a quality of existence more permanent than ordinary human experience. A realm below or within, sometimes called the other world, associated with the dead and with beings of great power, and with a kind of time that does not move the way ordinary time moves. And the human world in the middle, connected to both of the others, but belonging fully to neither. The other world, in particular, is a concept that runs through Irish mythology, with enough consistency that it appears to preserve something genuine from the pre-Christian tradition. It is not simply a land of the dead in the way the Greek or Roman underworld functioned. It is something closer to an alternate version of reality that exists alongside the human world and intersects with it at certain times and certain places. The times when that intersection was most accessible appear to have been the major seasonal transitions, particularly Sin at the end of October. The places where it was most accessible appear to have been the natural liminal spaces, caves and springs, and the shores of lakes and rivers. Places that exist at the boundary between one kind of thing and another. Come back to the forest for a moment. Come back to the person standing at the edge of the grove in the early dark before dawn, watching the light change. The grove is not a church. It has no walls, no door, no separation between the inside and the outside of the sacred. What makes it significant is the boundary itself, the edge where the cultivated world ends and something older begins. The Druids were, among other things, specialists in exactly that kind of boundary. People who understood, as far as our sources suggest, where the ordinary rules of the world thinned out and what was required at those thinner places. Whether they had a systematic theology, in the sense that a modern reader would recognize, is genuinely uncertain. What the evidence suggests is something more complex than a collection of unrelated superstitions, a set of interlocking ideas about cycles and boundaries and the relationship between different orders of reality that gave their practitioners a framework for understanding the world. Stryo uses the word philosophers to describe the Druids. Other classical writers use terms that associate them with the intellectual traditions of the Greek world. These comparisons are made by people with obvious cultural biases, but beneath the bias, there may be a genuine recognition. The Druids were thinkers. They were not a primitive survival from an earlier, simpler time. They were in the regions and periods our sources describe the intellectual class of a complex society grappling with the same fundamental questions that every sophisticated human culture eventually arrives at. What is the nature of the cosmos? What is the relationship between the human world and whatever lies beyond it? What do the living owe to the dead? What does this generation owe to the next one? Those questions have not gone away. The cluster of green in the high branches of the winter oak is still there if you know how to look for it. Chapter 5. The World Before Rome. Ancient accounts tell us that in the summer of around 279 BC, a Celtic army reached the sanctuary of Delhi. Delhi was not just any target. It was the most sacred site in the Greek world, the home of the oracle of Apollo, the place where the Greeks went to ask the gods what the future held. The ancient sources that describe what followed were written by Greek and Roman authors with their own purposes, and historians treat the specific details of the campaign with appropriate caution. What those sources agree on is that a Celtic force had come far enough south and far enough east to stand at the center of the Greek world. Whether the Druids had any role in that particular campaign is something we cannot determine from the sources we have. What the episode illustrates is something important about the Celtic world in the centuries before Rome became the dominant power in the ancient world. That world was not static. It was not a collection of primitive villages frozen in time, waiting to be civilized or conquered. It was a dynamic and expansive civilization that had, at its peak, spread its people and its culture across an enormous area of ancient Europe and beyond, from Ireland to Anatolia, from the forests of northern Germany to the valleys of northern Italy, and it needed to hold that world together. Something extraordinary. By around 300 BC, Celtic-speaking peoples and Celtic-influenced cultures occupied a stretch of territory running from Ireland and Britain in the far west to Galatia in what is now central, through Turkey in the east. In between, Celtic languages were spoken across much of what is now France and Belgium, and Switzerland, and southern Germany, and Austria, and the Czech Republic, and parts of Spain, and Portugal, and northern Italy. Archaeological evidence shows the family resemblance across this huge geography in what scholars call the Latine culture, named after a site in Switzerland where a large cache of Celtic artifacts was found in the 19th century. This is not an empire. There was no Celtic center issuing orders that were obeyed from Ireland to Anatolia. The political reality of the Celtic world was fragmented into many separate tribal groups, each with its own leadership and its own internal politics, capable of allying with neighbors against common enemies, and equally capable of fighting those same neighbors the following season. What connected this world was not political unity. It was cultural continuity, shared languages, mutually intelligible across shorter distances, even if diverging over greater ones, shared artistic traditions, the intricate interlaced metalwork, and the distinctive curve, linear designs that appear across the whole Latine world, shared social structures built around a warrior aristocracy, a professional learned class, and a broader population of farmers and craftspeople, shared ways of marking the significant moments of the year, and moving through all of that, cultural continuity, from community to community, and territory to territory, were the Druids. Caesar's observation that the Druidic institution is thought to have originated in Britain, and that people traveled there from Gaul for their most thorough training, implies something remarkable. It implies a network that transcended local political boundaries in which practitioners in different parts of the Celtic world recognized each other as belonging to the same tradition and maintained enough contact to agree on matters of doctrine and practice. How that network actually functioned is something we can only partially reconstruct, but its existence implies an infrastructure of movement and communication across the Celtic world that had to be maintained somehow in a world before Roman roads, before institutional postal systems, before any of the communication infrastructure that makes it easy to maintain connections across large distances. What it had were routes, river valleys, and mountain passes, and coastlines that people had been traveling for centuries, and a cultural framework that made the traveling practitioner a mountain passes, recognized figure who could expect hospitality and safety in communities that shared the traveling tradition. The annual assembly that Caesar describes, in which Druids from across Gaul gathered in the Poi territory of the Carnates tribe to resolve disputes and discuss matters of common concern, is the clearest evidence we have for this kind of organized network function. Caesar says this gathering is held in a consecrated place, recognized as the center of Gaul for this purpose, and that those who have disputes come from all directions and submit to the Druids' determinations. A gathering that serves as something like a Supreme Court and a venue for the renewal of shared doctrine, held without any permanent building or administrative apparatus sustained entirely by the agreement of a politically fragmented world that this gathering had legitimate authority. Now think about what made it work. In much of the Celtic world, as far as our sources suggest, the Druids had no army, they had no territory, they had no treasury, or permanent staff, or institutional infrastructure in any physical sense. What they had was the accumulated investment of the communities that depended on them, in their legitimacy. Every family that had sent a child for 20 years of training, every dispute that had been submitted to Druidic judgment and accepted, every generation that had grown up in a world where the Druids were simply part of how things worked. That accumulated investment created something harder to destroy than a building or a compry, but also harder to rebuild once it is gone. It created a presumption of legitimacy that functioned like the foundation of the entire cultural system. The geographic variation within this world deserves attention because popular accounts tend to treat the Celtic world as more homogeneous than it actually was. The Druids of Gaul are the ones we know most about through the classical sources simply because Gaul was the Celtic territory that Rome engaged with most directly and most thoroughly. Caesar spent years there. The accounts we have are detailed if biased. The Druids of Britain, the island that Caesar describes as the source of the tradition, are less well documented in the classical sources, but appear in the archaeological record with consistent evidence of the kind of ritual practice the sources describe. The island's relative distance from the Mediterranean world may have allowed the tradition to develop with less external interference, which would explain Caesar's statement that the most thorough students traveled there. Island, which Rome never conquered, and with which Roman contact was limited, preserved a tradition that remained vital long after what we know of Druidic practice in Gaul and Britain had been suppressed or transformed. We will return to Ireland at length in a later chapter, because it gives us a rare comparison case that helps illuminate what the tradition might have looked like without the specific pressure of Roman suppression. And then there is Galatia, the Celtic-speaking region of central Turkey, sometimes forgotten in accounts of this world, but worth pausing on here. The same restless energy that may have carried a Celtic army toward Delhi in 279 BC carried others further east into Anatolia, where they eventually settled in the region that took their name. The Galatians maintained Celtic languages and cultural practices for centuries after their migration. Their existence at the eastern edge of the Celtic world is a reminder of how far that world actually extended, and of the energy and mobility that had created it. The Celtic world that produced and sustained the Druidic tradition was not a marginal or minor civilization. It was one of the dominant cultural forces in the ancient world at its peak. Spread across an enormous area of ancient Europe, it did not collapse from internal weakness. It was absorbed and suppressed and pushed to the margins by a different kind of power, one that used roads and laws and administrative machinery and written records to bind conquered peoples into a single system. That process of absorption and suppression is what the next several chapters are about. But before we get there, hold the image of that summer in 279 BC, a Celtic force, standing somewhere near the center of the Greek world, at a point the ancient sources describe as one of the furthest reaches of Celtic expansion, looking at a world they could not hold before they knew it was going to be taken from them. Chapter 6. Rome looks into the forest. There is a document that has shaped everything most people in the Western world think they know about the Druids. It was written by one of the most skilled prose writers the ancient world produced. It was designed to be read aloud to audiences who wanted to be entertained and impressed. And it was written by a man who had very specific reasons to describe the people he was describing, in very specific ways. That document is the record of the GIC Wars, written by Julius Caesar in the 50s and 40s BC, covering his campaigns in Gaul between 58 and 50 BC. And before we use a single piece of information from it, we need to spend some time with the man who wrote it and the purposes it was written to serve. Caesar was not an ethnographer. He was not a historian in the modern sense committed to accuracy as a primary value. He was a politician and a military commander, engaged in one of the most consequential and controversial episodes in Roman history, the conquest of a territory roughly the size of modern France that Rome had not previously controlled, carried out under his personal command, producing enormous personal wealth and military prestige that he would use to reshape Roman politics entirely. The record of the GIC Wars was written and circulated in Rome while the campaigns were still ongoing. It was political communication, Caesar speaking directly to the Roman public about what he was doing and why it mattered in a context where he had enemies who questioned the legality and necessity of the war, and supporters who needed to be convinced that the investment in blood and money was justified. With that context established, read what he actually says. Caesar describes the Druids as one of two honored classes in Goish society alongside the warrior nobility. He says the common people are treated almost as slaves, kept in subjection, and never consulted about anything. He says the Druids preside over sacred matters, regulate sacrifices, and give rulings on all religious questions. Young men flock to them for instruction. They hold great influence. He describes their training, the 20 years, the memorization of verse, the refusal to commit their doctrines to writing. He describes their legal authority, the annual assembly, the power of exclusion from the sacrifices, as the ultimate sanction. He says they teach that the soul does not perish, but passes after death into another body, and that this teaching is the main incentive they offer for valor in battle. He says they have much knowledge of the stars, and their movements of the size of the universe, and of the earth, of natural philosophy, and of the powers and spheres of the immortal gods. So far, this is a portrait of an impressive and sophisticated institution. But then Caesar turns to what he needs his Roman readers to understand about why the conquest is necessary, and what these people are really like underneath the sophistication. He describes human sacrifice. He says the Gauls believe that the immortal gods can be appeased only if one human life is given for another. Some of them, he says, have colossal figures made of wicker work, the limbs of which are filled with living men, which are then set on fire so that the men are burned to death. The wicker man, that image, has had a life in the Western imagination for 2,000 years. It appears in films and novels and cultural references that most people could not trace back to their source. And it comes from a single text written by a Roman general, composing political communication for a Roman audience that needed to believe the conquest was justified. Caesar is not the only classical writer to describe Druidic human sacrifice. Strabo, Diodorus, Sigillus, and Pomponius Mela all make references to sacrifice in Celtic religious practice. The clustering of references across multiple independent sources gives the general claim more weight than if it rested on Caesar alone. But there is a significant distance between acknowledging that some form of sacrificial practice existed in the Celtic world and accepting every detail of the classical accounts at face value, and the specific details matter because they are doing specific rhetorical work. The Wicker Man image takes the sophisticated, philosophically impressive institution has just described and reframes it as barbaric in the most visceral possible way. It answers the question a thoughtful Roman might ask after reading the first part of Caesar's Wens, which is whether these people are really so different from us that conquest is justified. The Wicker Man says yes, unambiguously, memorably. Consider also what was happening in Rome at the time Caesar was writing. Roman religion itself included animal sacrifice as a standard practice. Roman history included episodes of human sacrifice documented in Roman sources, most notably the burial alive of pairs of Gauls and Greeks in specific ritual contexts during periods of extreme crisis. The Romans of Caesar's era were not people who could claim to stand entirely outside the practice of ritualized killing in religious contexts. The difference Caesar is constructing is not a difference between civilization and savagery, in any absolute sense. It is a difference between Roman ways of doing things and Jewish ways of doing things, framed to make the Roman ways appear normal and the Jewish ways appear monstrous. This is not an accusation that Caesar was lying, in the sense of fabricating things he knew to be false. It is an observation about how rhetorical framing works. The same practices described in different language, with different emphasis from different perspectives, produce radically different effects in the reader. Now turn to Tacitus, who gives us a different perspective from a different moment in the relationship between Rome and the Celtic world. Tacitus was writing roughly a century after Caesar, in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD. By his time, Gaul had been thoroughly incorporated into the Roman Empire for several generations. The Druids of Gaul had been suppressed by a series of imperial edicts. The story Tacitus tells is not the story of the conquest, but of what came after it. Tacitus is a more complex figure than Caesar from a source-critical perspective. He was a senator and a historian who had a genuine critical relationship with Roman imperial power, capable of describing Roman behavior with an irony and a moral seriousness that Caesar never employed. His portrait of the Germanic and British peoples sometimes functions as implicit criticism of Roman society. Holding up the integrity of people the Romans considered barbarians as a mirror for Roman corruption. In his Annals, Tacitus describes the Roman assault on the island of Mona, which we know today as Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales. This island, he says, was a stronghold of the Druids and a place of refuge for those fleeing Roman-controlled territory across Britain. The Roman general Suetonius Paulinus decided to attack it. Tacitus describes the scene on the shore as the Roman forces prepared to cross. The enemy lined the shore in a dense array of armed warriors. Among them were women dressed in black robes, with their hair loose and unbound, moving through the ranks holding torches. Nearby stood the Druids, their hands raised toward the sky, their voices carrying across the water. The Roman soldiers stood motionless. Professional military men froze at the sight of figures they could not categorize as ordinary enemies. Their general had to remind them who they were before they could cross. Tacitus is not saying the Druids had magical powers. He is describing the psychology of soldiers encountering a form of authority entirely outside their normal categories of threat assessment, an authority that did not operate through the threat of violence, but through something harder to name and harder to move past. Then the soldiers crossed, the shore was taken, the warriors were cut down, and the Druids with their hands still raised were cut down with them, and then the sacred groves were burned. What Tacitus does not do and this is significant, is describe the Druids of Anglesey as criminals or monsters in the way Caesar described the Wicker Man. His account has the quality of witnessing something genuinely significant being destroyed, rather than the triumphalist framing that Caesar brings to his accounts of Guish resistance. He chose to record the burning of the groves, specifically to put it in the historical record. Something worth recording was destroyed there. The Roman policy toward the Druids in this period is worth examining carefully because it was not simply a byproduct of military conquest. It was a deliberate policy pursued through explicit imperial edicts. The Emperor Augustus had already prohibited Roman citizens from practicing Druidism. The Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD, went further and abolished Druidism altogether within the empire. Tiberius had also issued edicts against Druidic practice. This level of specific legislative attention is unusual. Rome was generally tolerant of the religious practices of conquered peoples, as long as those practices did not directly threaten Roman authority. Why did Rome take this unusual step? One answer is political. The Druids represented an alternative source of authority in territories Rome was trying to control. As long as the Druidic institution retained its legitimacy in the eyes of the Celtic-speaking population, there was a center of gravity in those territories that Rome did not fully control. Another answer is that the Druidic system appears to have been specifically resistant to this kind of absorption that Rome used as a tool of imperial control. Their knowledge was not written down, could not be seized or examined or regulated. Their authority rested on a tradition that Rome could not simply co-opt by issuing a decree. The Druidic system was in this sense not something Rome could take over from the inside. Rome appears to have identified this combination of popular legitimacy and institutional inaccessibility as a specific kind of problem that required a specific kind of solution, and what it arrived at in practice was not engagement or absorption. What it amounted to in effect was the breaking of chains. Chapter 7. The Question of Sacrifice. Before this chapter begins, something needs to be said about how it is going to proceed. The subject of human sacrifice in Druidic practice is one where the sources are particularly complicated. The modern stakes are particularly high, and the temptation to arrive at a predetermined conclusion in either direction is particularly strong. Some accounts of the Druids minimize this subject to the point of dismissal. Others sensationalize it in ways that serve the same rhetorical purpose Caesar served 2,000 years ago. A responsible treatment has to resist both. So begin with what the evidence actually gives us, and be clear at each step about what kind of evidence it is, and what it can and cannot tell us. The classical sources contain multiple references to human sacrifice in Celtic religious contexts. Caesar's Wicker Man is the most dramatic and the most quoted, but it is not the only one. Stroud describes one method of divination used by the Vates that involves stabbing a man and observing the manner of his falling. Diodorus Siculus describes sacrifice by both stabbing and hanging. Pomponius Mela describes a form in which the entrails of human victims are read as omens. Lucan, a Roman poet writing in the 1st century AD, refers to the altars of the Celtic gods being drenched with human blood. That is a substantial accumulation of references across multiple independent authors, writing at different times and from different perspectives. The clustering makes it difficult to dismiss the general phenomenon as pure invention, even accounting for the rhetorical purposes these descriptions served. But every one of these accounts was written by a Roman or Greek author writing for a Roman or Greek audience. Everyone was produced within a cultural framework that systematically contrasted Roman civilization with Celtic barbarism. Everyone served, whether incidentally or deliberately, to justify Roman political and military dominance by establishing that Celtic peoples practiced things that Roman civilization found abhorrent. None of this means the accounts are false, but it means they cannot be read as neutral documentation, Now turn to what archaeology actually gives us. The most significant physical evidence comes from the bodies of people found preserved in the peat bogs of northern Europe. These bog bodies have been discovered across a wide area that includes Ireland, Britain, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, with dates ranging from roughly 800 BC to around the 3rd or 4th century AD, overlapping closely with the time frame of our story. The preservation of these bodies by the acidic oxygen-poor conditions of the peat is often remarkable. In some cases, we can see the face of a person who died 2,000 years ago with a clarity that feels genuinely uncanny. Toland man was found in Denmark in 1950. The people who discovered him initially thought they had found a recent murder victim. So complete was his preservation. He was a man of middle age, his face calm in a way that 2,000 years in a bog had not disturbed. He had been hanged with a braided leather rope still around his neck. He was found placed carefully in the bog in the fetal position, as though someone had taken care with where he ended up. His last meal had been a kind of grain porridge. Whatever happened to him, it was not random. The most studied of the British examples is the man found in a peat bog in Cheshire in 1984, and now kept in the British Museum, known as Lindo Man. Radiocarbon dating places his death somewhere between 100 BC and 100 AD. He was a healthy adult male in his mid-20s, well nourished by the standards of his time, with carefully maintained fingernails, suggesting he was not engaged in heavy manual labor. His last meal included a flatbread made from several types of grain. He died by multiple methods. He was struck on the top of the head with a heavy, blunt object, hard enough to fracture his skull. He was strangled with a twisted cord that was still around his neck when he was found, and his throat was cut. The triple nature of his death has attracted significant scholarly attention. Some researchers have suggested that the combination of killing methods may reflect a specific ritual requirement, possibly connected to the triadic structures that appear in the Celtic thought and practice more broadly. Others have urged caution about reading symbolic meaning into what might have other explanations entirely. The interpretation remains genuinely contested among specialists, and that contested quality should be acknowledged rather than smoothed over. What is not seriously disputed is that Lindo Man death was deliberate, and not the result of accident or ordinary violence. The care with which his body was deposited, and the physical evidence of his well-maintained condition before death, suggest this was not a simple killing. Groel man found in Denmark, and dating to a broadly similar ancient period, had his throat cut. From ear to ear, like Toland man and Lindo man, he shows signs of having been in reasonable physical condition before his death. The interpretation of these bodies is genuinely contested among specialists. The hypothesis that they represent sacrificial victims is widely held, but not universally accepted. Some researchers have proposed that some bog bodies represent the execution of criminals, since several ancient sources describe the Celts as executing certain categories of criminal by drowning or burial. The honest position is that the physical evidence is consistent with ritual killing, but does not prove it. Now step back from the specific evidence and engage with the broader question that this subject always eventually raises. Does the existence of human sacrifice, if it occurred, change our assessment of the Druids and the civilization they represented? This question is more complicated than it appears. The first complication is comparative. Human sacrifice as a religious practice was not unique to the Celtic world. The Roman world itself, the primary source of the accusation against the Druids, had its own documented instances of sacrificial killing. The burial alive of pairs of Gauls and Greeks in specific emergency rituals is described in Roman sources. The line between what Rome considered legitimate sacrifice and what it considered barbaric sacrifice was not a line between killing and not killing. It was a line between Roman ways of doing it and non-Roman ways of doing it. This is not an argument that all sacrificial practices are equally acceptable. It is an argument that applying the category of barbarism selectively to the Celtic world while exempting the Roman world from the same analysis produces a distorted picture. The second complication is the question of context. Every culture that has practiced some form of sacrificial killing has done so within a cosmological framework that gave the practice meaning. Understanding what a practice meant to the people who performed it is a necessary step before historical judgment, because without that understanding, we are not actually understanding what happened. We are simply projecting our own categories backward in time, what the Druids believed they were doing when they conducted sacrifices, what relationship they understood those sacrifices to establish between the human world and the divine world is something we cannot know with confidence from the sources that survive. The classical descriptions are hostile and external. The later Irish and Welsh texts do not describe human sacrifice in ways that give us clear access to the theological framework behind it. The third complication is the question of frequency. Caesar's wicker man, if taken literally, suggests mass sacrifice of large numbers of people as a regular practice. But Caesar's account is the most sensationalized element of the classical record, from the most politically motivated source. The other classical references describe human sacrifice in terms that suggest it was reserved for specific circumstances, major crises, and significant ritual occasions, rather than routine practice. The bog bodies, whose dates span several centuries and a wide geography, represent a relatively small number of individuals. Whatever they were, they represent a practice that was specific and unusual rather than commonplace, at least to the extent that the physical evidence can tell us. Having looked at the evidence carefully, the most defensible position is this: some form of sacrificial practice, including, in some circumstances, the deliberate killing of human beings, very probably occurred in the Celtic world during the period we are discussing. The specific details and the theological framework behind it are things we cannot reconstruct with confidence from the sources that survive. And the picture of systematic mass atrocity orchestrated by Druids as a regular feature of Celtic religious life is a picture that was constructed for political purposes by people who needed it to serve those purposes. Toland man lies in a museum in Denmark. His face is intact. His expression is calm, in the way that faces become calm after a very long time. Whatever happened to him, it happened within a framework of meaning that we cannot fully access. He was not a victim of random cruelty. He was part of something that his world considered significant enough to warrant the most serious possible action. What that something was exactly is one of the questions this subject leaves permanently open, and perhaps that is as it should be. Some things that happened in the deep past are not meant to be fully explained. They are meant to be looked at honestly, with the uncertainty left intact. Chapter 8. Anglesey and the Fire of 60 AD. Picture the strait just before dawn. The water between the Welsh mainland and the island of Mona is not wide. At its narrowest point, it is roughly a kilometre across. Calm enough on most mornings that you can see the other shore clearly. The low hills, the tree line, the place where the land meets the water and then stops. On a clear day from the highlands to the east, the island itself is visible on the horizon, a long, dark shape lying flat against the sea, like something that has always been there, and always will be. In the autumn of 60 AD, a Roman army stood on the eastern shore of that strait, and looked at what was on the other side. What they saw, according to Tacitus, was this: a dense line of armed warriors along the water's edge. Among them, women, dressed in black robes, with their hair loose and unbound, moving through the ranks holding torches, and standing apart, with their hands raised toward the sky. They dried their voices, carrying across the water, in words the Roman soldiers could not understand, but could feel the weight of. The Roman soldiers stood motionless. Tacitus says they were frozen, as if their limbs had stopped working, exposing themselves to be wounded without responding. Professional military men who had faced every kind of enemy the ancient world could produce stood on the shore of a narrow strait and did not move. Their general Gasonius Pinus had to remind them who they were before they could cross. Take a moment with that image before we move into the history, because it is the kind of detail that survives 2,000 years for a reason. Not because it tells us something supernatural happened on the shore of the many strait that morning, but because it tells us something true about the nature of the authority the Druids held. The kind that operates on something more fundamental than military threat. The kind that reaches into the part of a person that training and discipline cannot entirely reach. Then the soldiers crossed, and everything that happened next cannot be undone. To understand the full weight of what happened on Mona, you have to understand what Britain looked like 17 years after the Roman invasion under the Emperor Claudius had begun in 43 AD. The invasion had established Roman control over the southeastern and central portions of Britain relatively quickly. The land zone, the fertile plains that would eventually become the most thoroughly Romanized part of the island, fell within the first years of campaigning. Roman towns were established. Roman roads began to cross the landscape. The administrative apparatus of provincial life began extending itself across the newly conquered territory. But Britain was not Gaul. The island was larger and more varied than the Roman commanders had anticipated. The highland zones to the north and west resisted in ways the lands had not. And the resistance was not simply military. It had a center. That center was Mona. In the years since the invasion, as Roman control extended across southern and central Britain, the people and institutions that represented the pre-Roman order had been withdrawing westward and northward toward the places the legions had not yet reached. Tacitus describes the island as a refuge for those driven out of Roman-controlled territory across Britain, fighters who had lost their battles with Roman forces, communities displaced by Roman settlement, and the Druids. What this means is that Mona by 60 AD appears to have been one of the most important remaining centers of the Druidic tradition in Roman Britain. The place where the sacred grove still stood, and the training still continued, and the connection between the living practitioners and the accumulated knowledge of centuries was still being maintained in a form closer to its original institutional shape than almost anywhere else the legions had reached. The sacred groves that Tacitus mentions, the ones the Romans burned after the assault, may in a sense have functioned as the physical infrastructure of a knowledge system, the places where training happened, where the most important rituals were conducted, where the tradition reproduced itself in the only way it knew how, through the relationship between teacher and student, season by season, year by year, decade by decade. Suetonius Paulinus had constructed flat-bottomed boats to carry his infantry across. The cavalry either forded the shallower parts or swam alongside their horses. The crossing was made. The shore was taken. The warriors were cut down. The women with torches were cut down. The Druids, with their hands still raised, were cut down with them. And then the soldiers moved into Steve, the interior of the island, and burned the groves. Tacitus describes this with a phrase that has stayed with readers for many centuries. He says the Romans imposed a garrison and cut down the groves devoted to savage superstitions. Savage superstitions. That phrase is Tacitus using official Roman justification language, the framing that made the destruction of the groves a matter of civilized law enforcement rather than deliberate cultural eraser. But Tacitus is a writer who uses official language with a very precise kind of irony. He is not Caesar. He does not write triumphalist military history. He writes history that keeps a steady eye on the distance between what Rome said it was doing and what it was actually doing. He chose to record the burning of the groves, specifically to put it in the historical record, to make it something that could be read and thought about by people who came after. Something worth recording was destroyed there. Now look at what happened in the days immediately after the assault, because the timing reveals something that the straightforward military account obscures. While Paulus was securing Mona, the word reached him from the southeast. A revolt had broken out in the territory of the Aini tribe under their queen, the woman the Romans called Boudica. The revolt was spreading rapidly. Gamu Lord Dunham, the Roman settlement that is now Colchester, had already been destroyed. London and St. Tand were about to follow. Paulus had to turn his army around and march back across Britain to deal with the largest uprising in the history of the Roman occupation of the island. The revolt of Boudicca in 60 AD was triggered by specific Roman abuses. After the death of the Iceni king Prasutus, who had ruled as a client king under Roman authority, the Romans annexed his territory directly, flogged his widow, Boudicca, and assaulted her daughters. The personal dimension of the outrage was real and specific, but the scale and speed with which the revolt spread beyond the Iceni territory suggests that the personal dimension was not the whole story. The destruction of Camulodunum, the capital of the Roman province, and the site of a temple to the deified Claudius that the local population was required to fund, suggests something broader, a revolt against Roman occupation in a more fundamental sense. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing later than Tacitus, and with less direct access to the events, describes Boudicca as explicitly invoking Celtic gods and Celtic traditions in her calls to revolt. Whether the Druidic institution on Mona had any direct organizational connection to the revolt in the southeast is something the sources do not establish clearly. But the coincidence in timing, the assault on what appears to have been one of the last functioning institutional centers of the Druidic tradition in Britain happening in the same year as the largest anti-Roman uprising in the island's history, is the kind of coincidence that a careful historian notes, even without claiming to prove causation. What is clear is that Paulus's assault on Mona was not driven by narrow military necessity. Mona had no army capable of threatening Roman control in the lowlands. It was not a staging ground for military attacks on Roman territory. Its importance was institutional and symbolic, not strategic in a purely military sense. Paulus's went there because of what it represented. Because as long as Mona stood, and the grove stood, and the Druids on the island were functioning, the Roman project of incorporating Britain into the imperial framework was incomplete in a fundamental way. There was still a place visible on the horizon, from the mountains of northwest Wales, on a clear day where the old order persisted, where the authority that had organized Celtic Britain before the legions arrived was still operating, still training new practitioners, still maintaining the connection between the living tradition and the accumulated knowledge of many centuries. Burning the groves did not destroy that knowledge instantly. The people who had been trained before the assault were still alive, scattered across Britain and beyond. Oral tradition does not disappear the moment its institutional center is attacked. But the institutional center mattered in a way that is easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. The 20-year training system required stable conditions. It required communities willing to send their most promising young people away for a generation of preparation. It required a network of established practitioners to do the training. It required the kind of sustained investment that only happens when an institution has the confidence of permanence, when the people investing in it believe it will still be there when the investment matures. After 60 AD, those conditions no longer existed in Roman Britain. The network had been disrupted at what appears to have been one of its last functioning centers. The communities that might have continued to invest in Druidic training were now living under Roman administration that had made the practice of Druidism illegal. The people who had been trained before the assault were living in a world that was actively hostile to everything they represented. The transmission chain did not break all at once, but it began to fray in ways that could not be repaired as long as Roman authority persisted, and Roman law prohibited the tradition from reproducing itself. The last references to Druids in the classical sources from Gaul come from the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, and they describe figures who seem much diminished from the powerful institution Caesar had described. People called Druid by name, but who appear to be fortune-tellers and seers rather than the judges and theologians and teachers of the earlier tradition. The outline of something that was once much larger, surviving in reduced form in the gaps between the institutions that had replaced it. Anglesey stands today as a quiet island, The tourist sites emphasize the prehistoric monuments, the megalithic burial chambers, and standing stones that predate the Celtic period by thousands of years. The Roman assault is marked in some guidebooks and passed over in others. The groves are long gone. The people who stood in them, holding their knowledge in the only place it existed, the inside of their own minds, are gone with them. Much of what they knew disappeared from the record with them, in ways that no amount of subsequent scholarship has been entirely able to recover. That is the weight of what happened on Mona in 60 AD. Not a battle, a ripta, the kind that looks like a military operation from the outside and like the end of something irreplaceable from the inside. Chapter 9. The island Rome never reached. While the smoke from the burning groves of Anglesey was still visible across the many strait, there was another island to the west that no Roman general was looking at. Ireland. It lay beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of the legions, beyond the administrative ambitions of the empire that was in the process of disrupting what appears to have been one of the last functioning institutional centers of the Druidic tradition in Britain. Roman traders knew it existed. Roman geographers described its rough outline. The writer Tommy produced a map of the island in the 2nd century AD, placing rivers and tribal names that showed genuine knowledge, however imprecise, of what lay there. A small number of Roman artifacts have been found in Irish soil, evidence of contact through trade routes, rather than conquest. But Rome never crossed that water in force, and that fact, seemingly minor in the larger narrative of imperial expansion, turns out to be one of the most consequential facts in the entire history of the Druids, because Ireland gives us something that nowhere else in the Celtic world can give us: the ability to ask what the tradition looked like when it was not being suppressed, when it was allowed to continue developing on its own terms, under its own pressures, in its own direction. What we find in Ireland is not simple preservation. The tradition changed. It developed new forms and absorbed new influences and responded to the specific conditions of Irish society in ways that made it something distinct from what the classical sources describe in Gaul. But it changed from within, on its own terms, rather than being disrupted from outside by a force that had made its continuation illegal. The difference between those two kinds of change is the difference between a river finding a new course and a river being dammed. To understand what the tradition looked like in Ireland, you have to first understand what Ireland was in this period. Ireland in the early centuries AD was organized around a large number of small kingdoms, perhaps as many as 150 separate political units, called tuatha in the Irish language, each with its own king and its own territory. Above these small kingdoms sat a layer of more powerful kings, who exercised authority over groups of tuatha. Above those sat the most powerful provincial kings, with a concept of a high king of all Ireland. That was more aspiration than consistent political reality during most of this period. This political fragmentation was not chaos. It was organized fragmentation, governed by an extraordinarily elaborate system of customary law that specified the rights and obligations of every category of person in Irish society. In remarkable detail, that legal system was not written down. It was carried in the memories of a class of specialists called the Fillid, a word that translates roughly as poets or seers, who occupied a position in Irish society that closely parallels, in functional terms, the position of the Druids in the continental and British Celtic world. The Fillid were not always called Druids in the Irish sources. The word Druid appears in Irish texts and is clearly related to the word Druid. But in the Irish context, it tends to refer specifically to figures with prophetic or ritual functions, while the broader institutional role is distributed across several overlapping categories of specialist. What matters is not the label, but the function. And the function, when you look at it carefully, is recognizably continuous with what the classical sources describe. Like the Druids of the classical sources, the Fillid underwent an extended training period. The highest grade, the Olam, required 12 years of study before achieving full professional standing. The training involved the memorization of enormous numbers of stories and poems, the learning of complex metrical forms, and the acquisition of legal knowledge. Like the Druids of the classical sources, the Philid occupied a position of extraordinary social privilege. They were exempt from certain obligations that applied to other people. They could travel freely between the territories of different kings. They were entitled to hospitality wherever they went, and they had the power of praise and satire that we have discussed at length in earlier chapters. The power of the Irish poet's satire was deeply formalized in the Irish legal tradition. Law texts specify the conditions under which a poet could legitimately satirize someone. Forms that satire must take to be legally valid, and the damages that a person was entitled to claim if they were satirized unjustly. Satire that caused lasting damage to reputation was treated as a legal injury, comparable to physical assault. This formalization tells us something important. The role of the Philid was institutionally embedded in the legal system, in ways that gave it real and enforceable consequences. This was not honorary status. This was structural authority, woven into the fabric of how the society organized itself. The Irish legal tradition, which survives in a body of medieval texts known as the Bon Laws, is one of the most important bodies of evidence we have for what the pre-Christian Celtic intellectual tradition actually looked like. These texts were written down by Christian scholars beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries, but they preserve legal principles that are clearly much older than the manuscripts. The density and specificity of the law, the intricate categorization of social relationships, the technical vocabulary that has no obvious Christian origin, all point toward a tradition of legal thought that had been developing over many centuries before anyone wrote it down. What the Brehon laws represent, in short, is a legal tradition of genuine depth preserved in a form more complete than anywhere else in the Celtic world, precisely because Ireland was not subject to the Roman legal system that had displaced Celtic law everywhere Rome reached. Think about what that means for our purposes. Every other region where the Druids had flourished had been absorbed into a system of Roman law and Roman administration. The accumulated legal memory of those societies, the precedents and the principles and the specific ways of thinking about human relationships that the Druidic tradition had developed over centuries had been replaced by Roman alternatives. In Ireland, none of that replacement had happened. The legal tradition continued developing on its own terms. Now turn to the mythological tradition that Ireland preserved, because it is the richest single body of evidence we have for what the Druidic worldview looked like from something approaching the inside. The great cycles of Irish mythology, written down by Christian monks beginning in the 7th century, in manuscripts like the Book of the Duncow and the Book of Losta, contain material of extraordinary age and complexity. The Ulster cycle, centering on the hero Cuchulainn and the court of the Ulster king Conchobar, preserves a picture of Irish heroic society with parallels to the Homeric world of ancient Greece, specific enough that scholars have argued both traditions to preserve memory of a shared Indo-European heroic culture from much earlier centuries. The mythological cycle, dealing with the divine races who inhabited Ireland before the coming of humans, contains figures who appear to be versions of deities from the pre-Christian Celtic religious tradition. The Tuatha Danann, the divine people, are treated in the Christian manuscripts as ancient kings and heroes rather than gods, but their superhuman attributes and their connection to a world beneath the surface of ordinary reality mark them as the remnants of a genuine divine tradition, transformed by the process of writing down, but not entirely erased within these narratives. The figure of the Druid, or Drowie, appears consistently in ways that are recognizably continuous with what the classical sources describe. Advisors to kings whose judgments carry the weight of law, readers of natural signs, people whose curse or blessing operates within the world of the narrative as a genuine force, figures associated with the boundary between the ordinary world and the other world, who understand the conditions under which those realms intersect. That last pattern is particularly worth noting. The Druid in Irish mythology is consistently the person who knows how to navigate the crossings between worlds, who understands what sin means and what it requires, who can accompany someone to the edge of the realm of the dead and know what that crossing demands. This association is consistent with the broader picture of the druidic role we have been building across this story. The specialist in boundaries, the person who understands, as far as our sources suggest, where the ordinary rules of the world thin out and what is required at those thinner places. The fact that this pattern appears so consistently in texts written down by Christian monks, who had every reason to downplay pagan religious content, suggests it was too deeply embedded in the narratives to remove without destroying the pagan stories entirely. It survived because it was structurally essential to what the stories were about. Now ask the question that the Irish case makes possible to ask, in a way that it cannot be asked anywhere else. What would the tradition have become if it had been allowed to continue developing on its own terms? Ireland gives us a partial answer. The tradition remained recognizably itself across the changes it underwent, at least until Christianity arrived in force in the 5th century and began a different kind of transformation. The core functions continued. The knowledge was still held in people rather than primarily in documents. The authority still derived from the depth and duration of training rather than from political appointment. What ended the tradition in Gaul and Britain was not the inevitable forward movement of history. It was a specific set of decisions made by specific people with specific interests. The assault on Mona, the imperial edicts, the systematic creation of conditions under which the 20-year training system could not function. Ireland had none of that pressure for several more centuries, and during those centuries the tradition continued, not unchanged, not perfectly preserved, but alive, still being passed from one person to another, still being practiced, still meaning something to the communities that depended on it. The fire that burned at Anglesey in 60 AD did not reach the western horizon. What survived where the fire did not reach is the closest thing we have to a window into what the tradition was before the breaking began. Chapter 10. When Christianity arrived. Consider a monk in a scriptorium in Ireland in the early 8th century. It is cold. The room is small. The light comes through a narrow window and lands on the page in a thin, bright strip that moves across the vellum as the morning progresses. The monk has been writing for hours. He is transcribing something that someone older than him told him when he was younger, something that person had been told by someone older still, a chain of transmission that reaches back into a time before anyone in this room was born. What he is writing down is a story about gods, not the God he prays to, gods from an older world, beings of great power and strange beauty who lived in the hills and under the lakes and in places where the boundary between one kind of reality and another grew thin. He is a Christian man writing a pagan story, and he is doing it carefully because the story matters and he knows it, even if the theology is not his own. He is not unique. Across Ireland in the 7th and 8th centuries, monks were doing exactly this, writing down a world they had not lived in, preserving knowledge that had no place in their religion, but that they understood somehow was too important to let disappear. That impulse, and what it produced, is what this chapter is about. The version of this story that gets told most simply goes like this. Christianity arrived in Ireland in the 5th century AD. The missionaries preached, the kings converted, the Druids were swept aside, the old religion was replaced by the new one, and everything that had existed before was either destroyed or forgotten. That version is wrong in almost every detail that matters. What actually happened in Ireland between roughly 400 AD and 700 AD was one of the most complex cultural negotiations in the history of the Western world. It was not a simple replacement of one system by another. It was a slow, uneven, sometimes contentious, sometimes surprisingly cooperative process, in which two very different ways of organizing knowledge and authority came into contact and produced something that was neither of them entirely. Begin with what Christianity actually was when it arrived in Ireland. It was not arriving as a fully formed institutional church with a clear administrative structure and a settled relationship to local cultures. The Christianity that reached Ireland in the 5th century was a relatively young religion, still working out its own internal debates about doctrine and practice. It had been the official religion of the Roman Empire for less than a century outside the Roman Empire, which Ireland had never been part of. It had no established institutional presence, no network of bishops and administrative structures, no tradition of engagement with the specific social and legal frameworks of Irish society. The most famous figure associated with the Christianization of Ireland is the man known as Patrick, whose traditional dates place him in the 5th century. Though scholars continue to debate the specifics, Patrick was a Romano-British Christian who had been captured as a young man by Irish raiders and spent years in Ireland as a slave before escaping and eventually returning as a missionary. His two surviving texts, the Confession and the Letter to the Soldiers of Coroticus, are among the oldest documents we have in early medieval Latin from the British Isles. They are personal and direct, marked by the specific experiences of a man who knew Ireland from the inside in a way that most missionaries did not. He writes about preaching to kings and their households, about conflicts with what he calls the learned men of Ireland, a phrase scholars have read as a reference to the Druidic learned class. But Patrick was not the only missionary in Ireland during this period, and the Christianization of Ireland was not a single event orchestrated by a single figure. It was a process that unfolded over generations in different ways in different parts of the island, shaped by the specific social and political conditions of each region. What made the Irish case distinctive was the social structure into which Christianity was arriving. The Irish church that developed in the 5th and 6th centuries was not organized primarily around bishops and daskees in the Roman imperial model. It was organized primarily around monasteries, large monastic communities that served as centers of learning, artistic production, legal scholarship, and pastoral care. The abbot of a major monastery was often a more significant figure in the local social world than the bishop of a diocese. This monastic model suited Irish society in ways that the episcopal Roman model did not, and one reason it suited Irish society is that it replicated something of the structural role the Druidic learned class had played. A major monastery was in functional terms something like a Druidic institution, a center of specialized knowledge, a place that trained practitioners over extended periods, an institution that maintained the legal and intellectual heritage of the community. The men who built the Irish church were not, for the most part, people who wanted to destroy Irish culture. They were people who were part of Irish culture, who had grown up in a world where the Fillid and the Gemta legal scholars and the keepers of genealogy and story were central figures. Many of the most important figures in early Irish Christianity were themselves of noble birth, educated in the traditional Irish learned class system before their conversion, or the conversion of their families. Cola, the great Irish monk who founded the monastery of Iona off the coast of Scotland in 563 AD, is perhaps the best example of this overlap. Columba came from the royal family of the Northern O'Neill dynasty. He was educated in the Irish monastic tradition, but his formation also included elements of the traditional Fillid education. He was a poot as well as a monk. The later tradition credits him with intervening at the Convention of Druids around 575 AD to save the Fillid from being expelled from Ireland on the grounds that their knowledge was too important to lose. Whether this specific story is historically accurate is uncertain. It has the quality of a narrative constructed to illustrate a principle rather than to report a specific event. But the principle it illustrates is real. There were people in the early Irish church who understood the value of what the traditional, learned class preserved, and who worked actively to maintain it rather than destroy it. The result was something extraordinary. The monks of early medieval Ireland became the people who wrote down the oral tradition. Beginning in the 7th century and continuing through the following centuries, Irish monks produced a body of written literature unlike anything else in the early medieval world. They wrote down the law texts, They wrote down the genealogies. They wrote down the mythological cycles, material that was clearly pre-Christian in origin, and that in any other context might have been suppressed as pagan. They wrote down the poetry. They wrote down the technical treatises on metrics and poetic form that represented the accumulated craft knowledge of the Philid tradition. They did all of this in a Christian context, which meant they framed the pre-Christian material in ways that made it acceptable within that context. The gods became ancient kings. The other world became a more ambiguous place, neither the Christian heaven nor the Christian hell, but something older and stranger. The Druids in the narratives became figures associated with a past that was different from the Christian present, but not simply condemned. This framing involved real transformation. The material that was written down was not identical to the material that had existed in the oral tradition. Centuries of oral transmission had already changed it. The specific pressures of the Christian monastic context changed it further. Things that were too directly incompatible with Christian theology were modified or dropped, but the core was preserved. And in Ireland, where the tradition had been functioning at full strength when Christianity arrived, the core was substantial. The law texts preserved a legal tradition of extraordinary complexity that has no parallel anywhere else in the early medieval world. The principles they articulate do not come from Christian theology. They come from a tradition of legal thought that was functioning before Patrick set foot in Ireland. The mythological texts, for all their Christian overlay, preserve genuine memory of the pre-Christian religious world. The seasonal festivals that appear in the narratives preserve the structure of the Celtic calendar. The figure of the Druid in the narratives, whatever Christian framing surrounds them, operates according to principles recognizably continuous with what the classical sources describe. Over time, the balance shifted. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the old learned class had been substantially absorbed into the monastic system, or had transformed itself in response to the changed conditions. The Philid continued to exist as professional poets into the late medieval period and beyond. But the full institutional scope of what the tradition had been, the combination of legal, theological, medical, and cosmological knowledge held in a single trained class, had been broken up and distributed among different kinds of specialists. What the monks preserved is genuinely precious. Without the Irish monastic tradition, the Druidic world would be even more invisible to us than it already is. The law texts and the mythological cycles and the Bic poetry are not the Druidic tradition itself, but they are its most substantial traces. Think of that monk again. Cold morning, narrow window, the light moving across the page as he writes down a world he did not live in. He did not fully understand what he was preserving. He could not have, but he preserved it anyway. That is why this story can be told at all. Chapter 11. The Tradition Reinvented. It is a morning in the 1720s, and William Stukeley is standing in front of Stonehenge for what may be the 100th time. He has been coming here for years. He has measured the stones. He has drawn them from every angle. He has walked the surrounding landscape until he knows it, the way a farmer knows a field. He is one of the most careful observers of ancient monuments in England, perhaps in all of Europe, and he knows that what he is looking at is something extraordinary. He also knows that he does not know who built it. Nobody does. The stones are old in a way that defeats easy explanation. They were here before any written record. They were here before the Romans came. They were here before anyone who is alive today has any connection to. And standing in that field in the early morning light, with the stones casting their long shadows across the grass, stoutly begins to build a story. The story he builds will shape what most people in the Western world think they know about the Druids for the next 3 centuries. The problem is that it is not true. There is a peculiar thing that happens to lost traditions. They do not simply disappear. They get replaced by something that carries their name, but has been built from different materials for different purposes. And the replacement is often so confident in its own version of the story that the gap between what it claims to be and what it actually is becomes very difficult to see from the inside. This is what happened to the Druids in the 17th and 18th centuries. And understanding what happened is essential to understanding almost everything that is presented as Druidic knowledge in the modern popular imagination, because a substantial portion of that knowledge does not come from the ancient Celtic world. It comes from the imagination of early modern British antiquarians who were trying to solve a problem that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. The problem they were trying to solve was the problem of British origins. In the 17th century, educated British people found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The Renaissance had produced a renewed engagement with the classical world of Greece and Rome. The great civilizations of antiquity were the standard against which contemporary culture measured itself, and Britain, as a northern island on the edge of the Roman world, had a relatively modest place in that classical story. What Britain did have was a landscape full of monuments: Stonehenge, Avery, the great stone circles, and megalithic tombs scattered across the countryside. These were clearly ancient. They were clearly the work of a sophisticated people, and they had no obvious explanation. The Druids, described in the classical sources as the intellectual and spiritual elite of the Celtic world, seemed like a plausible answer to the mystery of who had built these things. The antiquarian John Aubrey, writing in the 1680s, was among the first to suggest explicitly that Stonehenge and similar monuments were Druid temples. He was careful to frame this as a hypothesis rather than a certainty, noting that it was the most probable conjecture he could form. The next generation was less careful. Stukeley was a physician and antiquarian who conducted detailed surveys of Stonehenge and Avery, and published influential books about both sites. He was a genuine scholar who made real contributions to the study of these monuments, producing measured drawings and observations that remain useful to archaeologists today. But Stukeley was also a man with specific personal and political interests that shaped his remin. En primant, he was a member of the Church of England, interested in demonstrating that the religious instincts of humanity pointed consistently towards something like Anglican Christianity. He was a British patriot who wanted a British antiquity that could stand comparison with Greece and Rome, and he had a talent for imaginative reconstruction that outran the evidence at his disposal. The Druids that Stukeley built from these materials were not the Druids of the classical sources. They were proto-Christian monotheists who had independently arrived at something very close to Anglican religious truth through the contemplation of nature. They were the spiritual ancestors of the British nation, whose ancient wisdom was encoded in the geometry of the great stone circles. They were, in short, exactly what Stukeley needed them to be. There was a fundamental problem with this reconstruction, and it was a matter of dates. Stonehenge was built in multiple phases over several thousand years. The main stone structure was constructed roughly between 2000 BC, which is to say, to between 4,500 and 4,000 years ago. The Druids, as described in the classical sources, and as evidenced by the archaeology, belong to the Iron Age Celtic world, which begins around 800 BC at the earliest. The gap between the construction of Stonehenge and the earliest period of Druidic activity is at minimum 1,1200 years, and more likely, considerably longer. The association of the Druids with Stonehenge is a historical connection that the archaeological and historical evidence does not support. It is a creation of the 18th century imagination, not a recovery of ancient truth. This problem was pointed out by careful scholars, even in Stukeley's own time. It has been confirmed by every subsequent advance in archaeological dating, culminating in the scientific dating methods of the 20th century that established the Neolithic construction dates of the major stone monuments beyond reasonable dispute. But the image proved extraordinarily durable because it served needs that historical accuracy could not serve. The Druid at Stonehenge gave Britain the kind of deep, mysterious, spiritually significant ancient past that the Romantic imagination demanded. It connected the present to a past that that felt both native and profound. It answered a longing that was real, even if the answer it offered was historically inaccurate. The Romantic movement amplified these tendencies enormously. The figure of the Druid became one of the characteristic images of British and Welsh Romanticism, appearing in poetry and painting, and eventually in the elaborate ceremonies of the Welsh Eisteddfod. The cultural festival revived in its modern form in the late 18th century, incorporating Druidic ceremonial, invented largely by a remarkable and somewhat unreliable Welsh scholar named Iolo Morgan, whose real name was Edward Williams. Williams was a stonemason and self-taught scholar from Glamorgan in South Wales, who had a genuine and deep knowledge of medieval Welsh literature and bardic tradition. He had also, unfortunately, a consistent habit of forging documents and inventing traditions that he then presented as genuine medieval survivals. The ceremonies he created for the revived Gorsedd of bards, the ritual assembly of poets and musicians that became central to the Welsh national Eisteddfod, were presented as ancient Druidic rites preserved in secret in the Welsh Bic tradition. They were not ancient. They were invented by Williams in the 1780s and 90s, drawing on his genuine knowledge of Welsh tradition, combined with his own considerable imagination and his specific romantic and nationalist purposes. The ceremonies Williams invented are still performed at the Welsh National Eisteddfod today. They are a living tradition, genuinely valued by the people who participate in them. But their relationship to the ancient Druidic tradition is the relationship of a modern reconstruction to the thing it is reconstructing, mediated by 2,000 years of change and by the specific creative imagination of an 18th century Welsh stonemason who was not always careful about the line between scholarship and invention. The modern Druid revival movements that began in the 18th century and continue today are a similarly complex phenomenon. The largest and most widely known, the order of bards, ovates, and druids, traces its lineage through a series of earlier organizations going back to the 18th century, taking its current form in the 1960s. It draws on Celtic scholarship, on the Romantic Druid tradition, on broader currents of nature, spirituality, and on the creative synthesis of its various founders and leaders. Its more thoughtful practitioners are clear that what they practice is a modern spirituality, inspired by ancient sources, rather than a direct continuation of the ancient Druidic institution. That is an honest and defensible position, but the popular image, the figure in white robes at Stonehenge, the keeper of ancient nature wisdom, the spiritual ancestor of a specifically British or Celtic identity, is not a recovery of anything ancient. It is a modern creation, assembled over the past 3 centuries, from fragments of genuine scholarship, romantic imagination, nationalist politics, and creative invention. The ancient Druids did not wear white robes as a uniform. They did not gather at Stonehenge for their ceremonies. They did not teach a proto-Christian monotheism. What the ancient Druids actually were is something considerably different from the popular image, more complex, more embedded in the specific conditions of their own world, more interesting in the ways that actual history is always more interesting than the simplified versions we reach for when we want comfort rather than understanding. The gap between what they were and what we have made them is itself a historical phenomenon worth taking seriously. Every era that has remade the Druids in its own image has been expressing something about its own needs. The 18th century needed a noble British antiquity. The Romantic era needed a connection to nature and mystery. The 20th century needed an alternative to institutional religion, rooted in the native landscape. The Druids have served all of these needs with remarkable flexibility, precisely because so little is actually known about them, that the imagination has enormous room to work. What gets lost in this process is the actual history. Stoutly stood in that field in the 1720s and looked at the stones and built a story that was not true, but that people needed to believe. He was not a fraud. He was a man doing what human beings have always done when they encounter a mystery large enough to require an answer. He reached for the story that fit the need. The need was real. The story was not. Chapter 12. What remains? There is a discipline that historians practice that is harder than it sounds. It is the discipline of saying what is actually there, rather than what you wish were there. Of looking at the evidence and describing what it genuinely supports, rather than extending it to cover the conclusions that would make the story more satisfying. This chapter requires that discipline more than any other in this story, because the question of what the Druids actually left behind in the world we live in today is one where the temptation to overclaim is very strong, and the actual evidence is more partial and more complicated than most popular accounts suggest. So begin with what can be said carefully. The most direct and least contested form of Druidic legacy is the one preserved in the medieval Irish and Welsh literary traditions. These texts are the closest thing we have to a record of the Druidic world from something approaching the inside. They were produced by people who were transforming an oral tradition into a written one, working within a Christian framework, but preserving material that was clearly older than Christianity, and that carried genuine memory of the pre-Christian Celtic world. The Irish mythological cycles, the altar cycle with its heroes and its picture of early Irish aristocratic society, the mythological cycle with its divine races and its layered cosmology, the Fenian cycle with its wandering warrior band and its songs of nature and loss. These are not Druidic texts. They are Christian texts that preserve Druidic memory. The distinction matters. They were shaped by the hands and minds of people who believed in a different God than the Seekers. The transformation that occurred in the process of writing them down was real and massors, consequential, but they preserve something genuine, the cosmological assumptions embedded in the stories, the significance of seasonal transitions, the reality and accessibility of the other world, the specific power of certain kinds of speech and certain kinds of knowledge. These are not Christian ideas dressed in Celtic clothing. They are the traces of a different way of understanding the world, surviving imperfectly in a context that was slowly replacing them. The Welsh tradition, preserved in texts like the Mabinogion and in the work of the medieval Welsh poets, offers something similar. The 4 branches of the Mabinogi contain figures and narrative patterns that connect to the same pre-Christian Celtic world the Irish texts preserve. Figures like Gwion, the trickster and master of knowledge in Welsh mythology, operate within the narrative according to principles of transformation and deep knowing that appear with appropriate caution about the many layers of tradition that surround them, broadly continuous with the Druidic intellectual world. Even if any direct connection cannot be established with certainty, these literary traditions are a genuine legacy, not a direct transmission, not an unbroken lineage, but a genuine preservation of something real, carried through the transformation of a culture's encounter with a new religion and a new technology of writing. Now move to the festival calendar, because this is one of the most widely claimed elements of Prancev, Druidic legacy, and one of the places where the most care is required. The 4 great seasonal festivals of the Celtic world, Sam, Ibolts, Belain, and Lugnasad, are real. They are attested in the Irish textual tradition with enough consistency and detail to establish that they were genuinely significant markers in the pre-Christian Celtic year. Their connection to the Druidic learned class, who were responsible for the maintenance of the ritual calendar, is reasonable to infer, even if it cannot be proven in specific detail. The connection between Samhain and the modern festival of Halloween is real in broad outline, while being considerably more complicated in its details than most popular accounts suggest. Samhain fell at the end of October and the beginning of November, marking the transition from the light half to the dark half of the year. The Irish texts describe it as a time when the boundary between the human world and the other world was especially thin, when supernatural forces were especially active. The ritual practices associated with it in the medieval Irish sources include feasting, the lighting of fires, and various forms of divination about the year ahead. The Christian feast of All Saints' Day falls on the 1st of November. The relationship between this placement and the existing Celtic festival has been debated by scholars for a long time. Some argue the Christian feast was deliberately placed to replace or absorb the pagan festival. Others argue the dating was independent. The honest position is that the relationship is plausible but not definitively proven. The modern Halloween draws on multiple historical streams. The Celtic Samhain tradition is one of them, but it is mediated through centuries of popular custom in Ireland and Scotland, and then transformed again by the specific cultural context of the Irish and Scottish diaspora in North America, where the modern form of the holiday developed in the 19th and early 20th centuries. A genuine historical thread connects sin to Halloween, but it is not a straight line. It is a thread with many knots and detours, and contributions from sources that have nothing to do with the ancient Celtic world. Describing Halloween as simply a Druidic festival flattens a complex history into something more direct than it actually was. Falling around the 1st of February and associated with the goddess Bridge and the first signs of spring, has a parallel in the Christian feast of Candlemas and in the Irish feast of St. Con. The Christianization of the goddess Bridge into the Saint Bridge is one of the most striking examples of the cultural negotiation we discussed in the previous chapter. The saint carries attributes of the goddess so completely that scholars have debated for castrations, where the goddess ends and the saint begins. Now move to the legal tradition, which is the most important and the least popularly known element of what the Druids left behind. The Brehon laws of Ireland, written down between the 7th and 9th centuries, but preserving principles of much greater age, represent the most substantial written body of evidence we have for the kind of legal and social thought that the Druidic learned class maintained. The principles they encode do not come from Christian theology. They come from a tradition of legal thought that was functioning before Patrick set foot Ireland. This tradition exercised real influence on the legal and social culture of Ireland through the pre-medieval period and into the early modern period. It shaped how Irish communities organized themselves and resolved disputes long after the political and religious context had changed completely. The claim that this tradition directly and demonstrably influenced the development of English common law, which is sometimes made in popular accounts of Druidic legacy, is one that the scholarly evidence does not support at the level those accounts suggest. English common law developed primarily from Norman French and in legal traditions with roots in Roman and Germanic law. The Brehon law tradition is a parallel development from the same deep Indo-European heritage, not a direct ancestor of the Anglo-American legal system. What can be said more carefully is this. When Ireland was eventually incorporated into the English legal system, the process was a collision between two very different legal cultures, rather than a simple extension of common law into an empty space. The memory of a different way of organizing legal relationships persisted in Ireland through the medieval period and influenced how Irish communities responded to and accommodated the imposition of English law. That influence is real, but it operates at the level of cultural memory and resistance rather than at the level of direct legal inheritance. Now, step back and look at the broader picture. What the Druids left behind is not a straight line of transmission from the ancient world to the broad present. It is a series of partial survivals, each transformed by the conditions of its survival. The Irish literary tradition preserves genuine memory of the Druidic world, but in a form shaped by Christian monks. The festival calendar preserves seasonal markers from the Celtic year, but in forms mediated by 1,000 years of popular custom and religious transformation. The legal tradition preserves principles of pre-Christian Celtic law, but in texts that were eventually displaced by a colonial legal system. And then there is something harder to categorize, but perhaps more pervasive than any of these: specific survivals. The figure of the Druid has functioned in Western culture across 2,000 years as a kind of mirror, a place where each era projects what it feels it is missing. The 18th century projected noble spiritual origins. The Romantic era projected harmony with nature. The 20th century projected wisdom outside institutional structures. Each projection is different. What they share is the reaching itself, the consistent sense that something important was lost when this tradition ended, and that the loss has not been adequately filled by what replaced it. None of these projections is historically accurate. The actual Druids were more complex, more embedded in the specific conditions of their own world, and less available as a universal symbol than any of these projections requires them to be. But the persistence of the reaching, the fact that each generation has found in the figure of the Druid a mirror for its own sense of what is missing, tells us something real. Not about the Druid specifically, about a recurring human need that the Druidic tradition, imperfectly remembered and heavily transformed, has been called upon to address across many centuries. The need is for a form of knowledge that is alive rather than archived, that exists in relationship rather than in documents, that connects the person who holds it to the community that depends on it. Something went out of the world when the groves burned and the transmission chains broke. The mirror keeps pointing toward the place where it used to be. Chapter 13. Why we cannot let them rest. Come back to the forest. Not the forest, where this story began before dawn, with the person standing at the edge of the oak grove holding knowledge that no one thought to write down. That forest is gone. The trees that stood in it have been gone for 1,000 years or more. The person who stood in it has been gone far longer. Come back to the forest we carry, because that is what this story has really been about. Underneath all the history and the careful reading of sources and the distinctions between what the evidence supports and what the imagination wants to add, it has been about the thing that keeps pulling people back toward a tradition they cannot fully see in a world that has given every reason to stop looking. Let us go back to the question that opened this story. Why did Rome treat the Druids as politically dangerous in a way that ordinary enemies were not? Not in the simple military sense. Rome was not threatened by the Druids the way it was threatened by an enemy army masked on a border. It was threatened by something harder to name and harder to address with legions. An authority it could not absorb, an institution it could not co-opt, a form of knowledge it could not seize and administer. Think about what Rome was built on. At its most fundamental level, it was built on the premise that the world could be organized, documented, and administered. That knowledge was something you stored outside the human body, in a place where it could survive the death of any individual person and be consulted by whoever held the appropriate authority. Roads that connected everything to a center, laws that could be read and applied and appealed, records that went back centuries and could be produced to settle disputes about what had been. Agreed. This was genuinely powerful. It created a system of governance that held together an enormous territory for a very long time. But it had a specific limitation. It could only absorb things that could be written down, mapped, taxed, and administered. Things that existed entirely in the relationship between living people, in the unwritten knowledge passed from teacher to student over 20 years, in the authority that rested entirely on the accumulated faith of a community, rather than on any document. Those things could not be absorbed. They could only be broken. The Druids represented a different premise entirely. Their knowledge lived in people, not in documents. Their authority was not granted by any institution that Rome could reach. Their legitimacy rested on a tradition of such depth and duration that it could not be replaced, simply by removing the people who held the highest positions within it. Rome appears to have identified this combination of popular legitimacy and institutional inaccessibility as a specific kind of problem requiring a specific kind of solution. And what it arrived at in practice was not engagement or absorption. What it amounted to, in effect, was the deliberate breaking of chains, the assault on Mona, the imperial edicts, the systematic creation of conditions under which the 20-year training system could not function. Generation by generation, the people who carried the knowledge died and were not replaced by others trained in the same way. Much of what they knew disappeared from the record with them, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but steadily over several generations, until the full institutional form of what the Druids had been ceased to exist in the territories Rome controlled. What came after was not nothing. Ireland preserved something. The medieval texts preserved something. The festival calendar preserved something. The legal tradition preserved something. These are real survivals, even if they are partial and transformed, but the living institution did not survive. The 20-year training, the network of practitioners, spread across an enormous area. The living transmission of a cosmological and legal and medical and poetic knowledge held entirely in human memory and reproduced entirely through human relationship. That specific quality of knowledge, living knowledge, knowledge that exists in relationship rather than in archive, is the thing that most resists being captured by any kind of record. It is the thing that the fragments and the survivals and the romantic reconstructions are all reaching for without being able to grasp. And it is perhaps the reason why the Druids keep being reinvented. Not because the people doing the reinventing are confused about history, though some of them are, but because the need that the traditions served, the need for a form of knowledge that is alive and relational and connected to the specific rhythms of the natural world, is a need that has not gone away. It is a need that the dominant institutions of Western civilization, with their archives and their credentials and their separation of knowledge from wisdom, have not fully met. The romantic Druid in white robes at Stonehenge is not the historical Druid. We have established that clearly enough in the pages of this story. But the person who finds themselves drawn to that image, who feels in it some satisfaction of a need that their ordinary life does not meet, is not simply being foolish. They are responding to something real, even if the image they are responding to is a construction built on misreading and romantic invention. The question worth asking is not whether the modern Druid revival is historically accurate. It is not the question worth asking, is what it tells us about what is missing from the world that the people reaching for it live in. And then, having asked that question, to go one step further, to ask what it would mean to take the actual history seriously, not as a romantic origin story for a modern spiritual movement, but as a genuine account of what human beings once built, and what was done to it, and what was lost. The actual history does not offer the consolation of secret survival, or unbroken lineage, or ancient wisdom waiting to be rediscovered. It offers something harder and more honest, the record of a specific thing that existed and was broken by specific people, making specific choices for reasons that had everything to do with the mechanics of power and nothing to do with whether the thing being broken had value. Those choices had consequences that lasted for the rest of history, and they point across 2,000 years of distance to a question that has not become easier to answer. What are we allowing to burn? What transmission chains are we breaking? What knowledge are we letting disappear from the record? Because the people who hold it are not powerful enough to defend it, and the people with the power do not see why it matters. That question does not resolve into a ceremony at Stonehenge or a spiritual practice that makes the modern world feel continuous with the ancient one, but it is the question that this history honestly told leaves us with. The person at the edge of the oak grove in the opening of this story walked back to tell the others what she had found, what she knew from watching the light change and reading the signs and thinking carefully about what they meant was worth knowing. The community she walked back to depended on what she carried. We do not know what she told them. We do not know what she knew. The transmission chain that would have brought that knowledge to us was broken before anyone thought to write it down. What we know is that she knew something, that it took a lifetime to learn it, that it mattered to the people who depended on her, and that the world she walked back into is gone so completely that we cannot fully imagine it from where we stand. The fire that burned the groves of Anglesey burned a very long time ago, but the light from it is still reaching us, and it is still worth asking what we lost when it went out.